the applause started before he finished. That's the part nobody talks about. Not the night itself, not the papers the next morning, not what happened to the man who thought he owned the room. What people forget, what they always forget, is that the applause started before Eldon Barnes lifted his hands from the keys. The room heard the music and couldn't wait. Eldon Barnes had been mopping the same corridor at the Meridian Grand Hotel in Ottawa for 11 years. The south wing, third floor. The stretch of marble hallway that connected the grand ballroom to the private dining suites. 140 feet of floor. Eldon knew every tile by heart. Knew which ones clicked under the mop handle if you pressed too hard. Knew which section of wall reflected the ceiling's chandeliers in a way that made the whole place look like it was underwater. He arrived at 5:15 every morning, left at 2:30 in the afternoon. In between, he moved through the hotel like a current, quiet, consistent, invisible in the way that only certain people are ever asked to be invisible. The other staff called him Barnes. Not Mr. Barnes, just Barnes. Said it the way people say a piece of furniture. Without thinking, without meaning anything by it, but meaning everything. The newer housekeeping staff sometimes asked him questions. How long have you been here? Doesn't it bother you? The sameness of it? Eldon would consider the question like it deserved real consideration, which he believed all questions did. The floor doesn't change, he'd say, but the light does. Every morning the light is different. They never quite knew what to do with that. What the hotel did not know, what the Meridian Grand, with its 12 floors and its rooftop bar and its framed photos of visiting dignitaries lining the executive suite hallway, did not know, was what Eldon Barnes had been before he was Barnes. What Eldon Barnes had been for 22 years was one of the most respected concert pianists in the country. Not famous. Not the kind of famous that puts your face on the side of a bus or your name in the mouth of every arts journalist from Vancouver to Halifax, but known. Known in the way that musicians know each other, deeply, without fanfare, with the particular reverence that professionals reserve for someone who has genuinely mastered something. Eldon had studied at the Glenn Gould School in Toronto, had performed at Roy Thompson Hall twice before he was 30, had been part of a chamber trio that played residencies at Carnegie Hall, not the main hall but the Will Recital Hall, which anyone who knows anything about music knows is not nothing. He had spent 3 years in Europe, Vienna, mostly, some Paris, a winter in London that he still thought about when the Ottawa cold got inside his coat. He played Ravel the way Ravel asked to be played, not as a display of technique, but as a question about what sound actually was. His Chopin made older musicians quiet in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. Then, when Eldon was 41, his right hand began to shake. Not dramatically, not all at once. It started as a tremor that appeared only when he was tired, then only when he was cold, then gradually, over the course of 18 months that he spent pretending he did not notice, it began to appear whenever it wanted to. The diagnosis took another year. Essential tremor, the neurologist said. Not degenerative in the way Parkinson's was degenerative, but not nothing either. Manageable with medication, treatable to a degree, but not for performance. Not at the level Eldon had performed, he tried. Stayed on the circuit 6 months longer than he should have. There were nights when the medication held, and the music came out clean, and he almost believed he had been wrong to worry. Then there were other nights, one in particular, in Montreal, at a benefit concert, in front of 300 people who had paid good money and deserved better, when his right hand simply refused, mid-phrase, in the third movement of a Brahms intermezzo, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing Eldon Barnes had ever heard. He did not perform publicly after that. He moved back to Ottawa. He had grown up in Ottawa's South End, in a house that no longer existed on a street that had been widened into a 4-lane road, and he took the job at the Meridian Grand because it was available, and because it paid enough to cover the rent on a small apartment on Carling Avenue, and because mopping a floor at 5 in the morning asked nothing of his hands except steadiness, and his hands, in the morning before the day wore them out, were still steady. That was 11 years ago. He was 53 now. He mopped the floor. He watched the light change. He went home and ate dinner alone, and sometimes in the evenings sat at the small upright piano he kept in the corner of his living room. A battered Heinzmann with 3 sticky keys, and played quietly, slowly, for himself alone. He had made peace with that. Most days he had made peace with that. The event was called the Hartwell Foundation Gala, annual fundraiser, black tie. The grand ballroom, full capacity, which meant 320 seats, 12 sponsor tables at the front, and a raised platform where a 9-foot Steinway concert grand had been delivered that morning by 4 men in gray uniforms who treated it with more visible respect than the hotel treated most of its human staff. Eldon had watched them bring it in, had stood with his mop at the ballroom entrance and watched the piano clear the doors with about 4 inches to spare. He hadn't meant to stop, he just had. The Steinway was a Model D black lacquer. One of the older ones. You could tell by the way the fallboard sat, slightly heavier at the hinge side. Eldon had played a Model D exactly twice in his life, and both times he had felt, underneath his hands, something that he could only describe as the instrument paying attention. He moved on, finished his floor, clocked out at 2:30 as usual. But that night, that particular Thursday in October, when the temperature in Ottawa had finally committed to being cold, and the leaves on the Rideau River path had gone fully orange, and nobody was surprised anymore by the dark. Eldon came back to the hotel. He told himself later that he wasn't sure why. He knew why. He knew exactly why. He came in through the service entrance with his access card and walked the empty South Wing corridor at 10:47 p.m. The gala was in its 3rd hour. The dinner portion had ended. The speeches were done. The fundraising portion, the part where a young pianist from the National Arts Center Orchestra was supposed to perform a 30-minute set, was not due to begin for another 15 minutes. The ballroom side doors were closed. The hallway was silent. The chandeliers were dimmed for the event, which meant the corridor had that particular amber quality that Eldon associated with late nights and other people's lives. He did not tend to go into the ballroom. He went into the ballroom, not through the main doors. Those were monitored by the event staff. There was a side door near the stage left curtain, a door that connected the ballroom to a small equipment corridor, and that door had a lock that Eldon had personally reported as faulty 6 months ago, and that had, in the tradition of facilities requests at the Meridian Grand, not yet been repaired. The door opened quietly. Eldon stepped into the equipment corridor, which was dark and smelled like cable wrap and wood polish, and he stood at the gap where the corridor curtain met the edge of the stage. He could see the piano from there. The Steinway sat at center stage, lit by a single overhead spot. The lid was up at full stick. The bench was empty. From where Eldon stood, he could see the keyboard. All 88 keys, white and black, perfectly still. He did not plan what happened next. That is the only way to account for it. Eldon Barnes walked out of the equipment corridor, across the side of the stage, sat down at the Steinway Model D, and placed his hands on the keys. The ballroom was full. 320 people in evening wear, mid-conversation, drinks in hand. They did not immediately notice him. There was a low hum of 300 voices and the percussion of cutlery and glasses and the particular ambient noise of expensive rooms. Eldon sat for a moment with his hands resting on the keyboard, not pressing. Just resting, feeling the resistance, feeling the weight of the keys beneath his fingers, feeling the particular way this piano was tuned. A half-degree warm in the upper register, which was exactly right for the room. He played the first note, a single middle C, held it, let it fill. The nearest table went quiet, then the next one. The quiet moved outward from the piano like a ripple, table by table, until the entire room had gone still without anyone deciding to make it so. Eldon played the opening phrase of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. And then, because the room was that kind of room, because the Steinway was that kind of piano, because Eldon Barnes was that kind of musician, even now, even at 53, even after 11 years of 5:15 a.m. mornings and 140 feet of marble corridor, the music simply took over from there. Nathan Voss was not a musician. Nathan Voss was the kind of man who understood music the way he understood most things, as something that existed to reflect well on whoever was paying for it. Nathan Voss was the managing director of a private equity firm with offices on Bay Street and a secondary residence in Mont Tremblant and a reputation in Ottawa fundraising circles as the kind of donor whose check you accepted regardless of how he behaved at the dinner table. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered in the way of men who had once been athletic and now maintained the shape of it without the substance, and he wore his money the way some people wear cologne. You were aware of it before he entered the room. He was the lead sponsors of the Hartwell Gala. His name was on the program. His table was at the front with a direct sightline to the stage. Nathan Voss heard the piano begin. He turned in his chair. He saw at the Steinway a black man in a gray hotel uniform, the Meridian Grand staff uniform, which Voss recognized because he held an executive membership and used the hotel's private dining rooms twice a month. He did not hear the music. What Nathan Voss heard when he turned and saw Eldon Barnes at the piano was an intrusion. He stood up from his table. His companion, a younger woman in a deep green dress who had been watching the stage with an expression of complete stillness, put a hand on his arm. He moved past the hand. He walked to the stage stairs, walked up them, walked to the piano. Eldon was 3 bars into the second phrase. His right hand was steady. The medication had held. He was somewhere inside the music in the way that you only go when you have stopped performing and started playing, and those are not the same thing. Nathan Voss reached out and grabbed Eldon's right shoulder. The music stopped. The room, which had been entirely silent, became a different kind of silence. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Voss said. He did not lower his voice. He had never been the kind of man who lowered his voice. Eldon did not move immediately. He looked at the keys for one moment. Then he turned and looked at Nathan Voss. "Get off this stage," Voss said. "Right now. You don't belong up here." There was a sound from the room. Not a word, not a protest. A sound, the involuntary kind that comes out of a crowd when something registers as wrong before the brain is caught up to categorize it. "Get your hands off my piano," Voss said. "You want to touch something in this room, go find a mop." Eldon stood up from the bench slowly. Not because Voss was making him. Not because of the hand on his shoulder which Voss had now released. He stood because he had finished standing, and standing was the next thing that needed doing. He looked at Nathan Voss for a long moment. He said very quietly, "I apologize for the interruption," and he turned to leave the stage. What happened next came from a table near the back. A man's voice, older, carrying the particular projection of someone who had spent decades in rooms that expected to hear him. "Mr. Voss." The voice belonged to a man named Clifford Osey, Dr. Clifford Osey, Professor Emeritus of Music at the University of Ottawa, and for 12 years prior to that, a programming director at the National Arts Center. He was 74 years old. He was at the gala because his former student was the young pianist scheduled to perform, and he had been until approximately 90 seconds ago, having a perfectly adequate Thursday evening. He was standing now. "Mr. Voss, doctor." Osey said again from across the room, "Do you know who that man is?" Nathan Voss, still on stage, turned toward the voice. "That," said Dr. Clifford Osey, "is Eldon Barnes." The name landed in the room differently depending on who was hearing it. For most of the 320 people in the grand ballroom, it registered as a name they should perhaps recognize. For 6 or 7 people in that room, the ones who had been in the right concert halls in the right decades, who had been paying the right kind of attention, it registered like a key turning. Voss looked blank. "He performed at Roy Thompson Hall," Dr. Osey said. He was moving now, walking toward the stage, and the room was making way for him without being asked. "He played the Wheel Recital Hall at Carnegie. He has forgotten more about that instrument than either of us will ever know." He reached the stage stairs. He climbed them. He stood beside Eldon Barnes, who had not yet left, who was standing at the edge of the stage with his hands at his sides, very still. Dr. Osey looked at Eldon. "Would you play?" he said. "If you're willing." And something in Eldon's face shifted, not dramatically, not the way faces shift in movies, with a sudden filling of light. Just a settling, a small, quiet decision being made behind the eyes. He turned back to the piano. He sat down. He found the place in the Chopin where he had stopped. He picked up the phrase from there. And then he played. Not the polite 30-minute set that the evening had scheduled, not a carefully chosen program designed for a fundraising audience, but the music as Eldon Barnes knew it, which moved from Chopin into a passage of Oscar Peterson that had no business following Chopin and was therefore perfect, and from there into something that Eldon himself had written years ago, a piece with no title that he had never played for anyone, that had lived in his hands all this time waiting for a room large enough to hold it. When he finished, he sat for a moment in the silence. Then the applause came, and it came before he lifted his hands from the keys, before he was technically finished, before the fineful resonance had cleared, because the room could not wait, because some music makes waiting feel disrespectful. Nathan Voss was no longer on the stage. He had descended at some point during the Peterson and made his way back to his table, where he sat with his hands flat on the cloth and his face arranged in an expression that had no comfortable name. The Meridian Grand's general manager, A careful and generally intelligent man named Mr. Pradeep Suri had been alerted to the situation by his event coordinator at approximately the same moment Eldon began the Peterson. He arrived at the ballroom entrance in time to watch the end of the untitled piece. He stayed in the doorway without speaking until the applause finished. Then he found Eldon backstage. Eldon was standing in the equipment corridor, the same corridor he'd come through, with his hands in his pockets. His uniform was the same gray it had always been. The corridor smelled the same as it always had. Mr. Suri said, "Barnes." Then he stopped, reconsidered something, started again. "Eldon," he said, "I need to ask you some questions about tonight." Eldon nodded. What followed was not a firing. What followed was, in fact, its opposite. Mr. Suri was many things, and one of those things was a man who understood when the situation had already decided how it was going to end, and this situation had decided. 3 people from the audience had already approached hotel staff asking for the name of the pianist. One of them was a journalist from the Ottawa Citizen who covered arts and culture and who had, before making her way to the event coordinator, already sent a text message to her editor with the words, "You need to hold space for me on the arts front tomorrow." I'm not kidding. Dr. Clifford Osey had spoken to the event coordinator personally and asked, with the particular courtesy of a man who does not need to threaten because he has never needed to threaten, that the hotel consider how it wished to be characterized in whatever came next. Mr. Suri asked Eldon whether he would be willing to speak with the journalist. Then he asked, more carefully, whether there was anything the hotel could do, whether there were things, conditions, arrangements, that would make Eldon's situation more what it should be. Eldon considered this. "The lock on the equipment corridor door," he said. "I reported it in April." Mr. Suri blinked. "I'll have it fixed Monday." "And the third-floor south wing floor buffer," Eldon said. "The motor's going. You'll need to replace it, not repair it. I'll order one." Eldon nodded. "Thank you," he said. And then, because this was Eldon Barnes and he meant it, "The piano was extraordinary. You should have it back for the winter series." The Ottawa Citizen article ran 2 days later, not one, because the journalist, her name was Sandra Kamau, had made calls, had reached former colleagues and concert programmers in Toronto and Vienna, had tracked down a recording from the 2003 Roy Thompson Hall performance that a music librarian had digitized for an archive project, and that was, she wrote in the piece, staggering in its clarity and control, the kind of playing that makes you feel the room where it happened. The headline was straightforward, not dramatic. Ottawa journalists tended toward the understated, which sometimes served the story better than drama did. Former concert pianist discovered at Ottawa Hotel. Working as custodian for 11 years, it was picked up by the CBC, then by several national outlets, then by a music blog in London that had a following among classical music listeners, and that framed the story not as tragedy but as something more complicated, as a question about what the industry did with musicians when the industry decided it was done with them. Nathan Voss did not issue a statement. His communications director issued a statement on his behalf describing the evening as a misunderstanding and expressing admiration for the talent of Meridian Grand staff. The statement did not use the word apology. 3 board members of the Hartwell Foundation reached out to the foundation's executive director within 48 hours of the article's publication. Nathan Voss's name was removed from the gala's lead sponsor, listing before the foundation's website was updated for the following year. These things happen quietly. They happen in emails and board calls and conversations that leave no public record, but they happen. The National Arts Center reached out to Eldon 6 weeks after the article ran. Not an offer of a residency. Eldon's hands were what they were, and he had known that for 12 years, and he did not want to pretend otherwise. What they offered was a conversation about whether there was a role for someone with his background, his ear, his particular knowledge of the instrument, in their education programming. Whether there were young musicians in Ottawa who might benefit from the specific kind of teaching that can only come from someone who has played at that level and then had to learn how to live when playing was no longer possible. Eldon said he would think about it. He thought about it for 3 days. He walked the South Wing corridor twice during those 3 days, because the floor was his and he had not stopped caring for it. He watched the light move through the hallway in the particular morning way it moved, different each day, the same corridor, different light. On the 3rd day, he called them back. He still works at the Meridian Grand. He negotiated his hours. Mornings only now, 5 days a week instead of 6. And he teaches on the afternoons when he isn't there, in a small room at the Nax with a Yamaha upright and a window that faces the canal. He does not perform. He has not performed publicly since Montreal, and he does not expect to again. And most days, this is not a loss he carries with him so much as a fact about himself. The way the floor tiles are a fact, the way the light is a fact. But there is a recording now. Sandra Kamau's editor had the foresight to send a videographer to the hotel the night she filed, and someone in the crowd had recorded the full performance on a phone, and the two recordings together captured most of it, and the recording exists, and people have heard it. More than 2 million people at last count have heard Eldon Barnes play the untitled piece, the one he wrote years ago with no audience in mind that lived in his hands waiting for a room large enough. The room, it turns out, was larger than he knew.